Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website as well as through our Facebook streaming program. We would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that your mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as we prepare to begin. For those watching online now and in the future, you are, of course, welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org, and we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage following this presentation for everyone's future reference as well. Leading the main discussion and welcoming our special guest is Thomas Spoor, who serves as Director of our Center for National Defense. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, he spent over 36 years in the U.S. Army and attained the rank of Lieutenant General. His assignments have included service in the Office of the Undersecretary of the Army, at the Department of the Headquarters for the Department of Army, as well as United States forces in Iraq. He has also been Commandant of the U.S. Army Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear School, pertinent to today's discussion. Following the presentation of our main speaker, Michaela Dodge, our Senior Policy Analyst for Defense and Strategic Policy, will then lead a discussion of this issue further. Tom, the program is yours.
John, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and welcome. Unlike the Army and the Marine Corps, 9 o'clock in the morning is a very early time for think tanks to go to work here, and so my thanks to you for coming for this important discussion. Within the Congress, one of the strongest voices advocating for a strong U.S. missile defense capability belongs to Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska, and we are both honored and fortunate that he graciously agreed to provide the keynote remarks for today's panel. Serving since 2015, Senator Sullivan serves on 4 committees, including the important Senate Armed Services Committee. He has been a clear-eyed advocate to build the nation's defenses, and this year he directly influenced the Senate's version of the National Defense Authorization Act to strengthen America's missile defenses, calling for increased numbers of interceptors, better sensors, and better integration of all the components within the system. Before his election to Congress, Senator Sullivan served as the Alaska's Attorney General and the Commissioner for Natural Resources. He holds bachelor's degrees from Harvard and master's and law degrees from Georgetown University. Significantly and near to my heart, Senator Sullivan is a member of the United States Marine Corps Reserve, holding the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and has served in various positions over the course of his 23-year military career, including deployments to Afghanistan and other locations in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Senator Sullivan.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, General, and thank you, by the way. I was reading your bio, and boy, very impressive, 36 years in the U.S. Army, so thanks for all that you've done for our country and continue to do. I also want to thank everybody here at Heritage, Michaela, General Todorov, so many others. I know the panel is going to continue after my remarks, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of what you're doing, your expertise. As a matter of fact, some of you are helping us as we design this bill that I'm going to talk about over the last year. So just all I want to say is keep it up. Right? Your impact is very powerful. It's very important, and the work you do. Folks like myself read it, use it. It helps us understand the issues. So thank you, and thank you for hosting this panel and giving me the opportunity to say a few words on missile defense today. You may have read there's a little bit of stuff going on in the Senate. Health care, we're going to try and get to tax reform, growing the economy. As the General just mentioned, we just marked up the NDAA. I'll talk about that in a little bit. National security issues, of course. I've been one of the newer members of the Senate who have been encouraging, so far successfully, our leadership in the Senate to kind of look at the calendar, look at the agenda, and say, whoa, do we really need to take a 6-week recess in August? My view is we should have canceled the whole thing because we have too much work to do. We've canceled 2 weeks of it, and that's a good start. And so, but one of the things we need to be focusing on is our national security, and in particular, from my perspective, missile defense. So let me begin with a little bit of an interesting story that occurred last year around this time. I led a CODEL with two other senators, Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, Senator Cory Gardner, who's also the chair of the subcommittee on the Foreign Relations Committee on Asia, so someone who's very interested in the Asia Pacific. And we went to South Korea. And, you know, we were looking at some of the national security issues. I was certainly interested in what was going on in terms of THAAD and our missile defense. You know, if you look at the history of America's missile defense, there was a recent report that stated it has been, quote, a trend of high ambition followed by increasing modesty, unquote. And I think that describes it well. You know, during the Obama years, the missile defense, at least in the United States, was cut very dramatically, almost by 50%. So when we were in South Korea last year, a lot of our focus was on missile defense, the defense of the Korean Peninsula. We had a number of good meetings, including with General Brooks, the commander of our forces over there. But possibly the most interesting meeting we had was with a very recent high-level North Korean defector. Matter of fact, at the time, he was thought to be the highest level North Korean defector ever. And so we had the opportunity to meet with him. It was rather interesting. When we were arranging the meeting, we got kind of the message back that they were interested, but they wanted, I think it was a couple $1,000 to meet with him, which we responded, well, we don't do that in the United States, but at least this guy's learning the capitalist system rather quickly. And then when we did meet with him, it was kind of interesting, a hat, sunglasses, he had two minders next to him on what he could say and couldn't say. And I had a number of questions for him, but the two most memorable for me were, you know, in these questions and answers just showed how people think differently from different cultures, particularly somebody like this, who was raised in an authoritarian regime. My first question, I wanted to try and get the sense of like the security apparatus, right? Is there kind of a budding, you know, group of North Koreans who are resisting the regime? How do they think about it? How do they think about security? So I asked him, I said, what would happen if there was say a North Korean young man in his 20s who went to the downtown square in Pyongyang with a sign and a bullhorn and just said, and started protesting. Kim Jong Un is a dictator. Kim Jong Un is a fat idiot, right? This is all through the translator, and he's kind of looking at me, and then he answers real quickly, and I get the translation back, and the answer was, no, I said, what would happen to that man? And his answer back to me was, that man doesn't exist. Again, just kind of, they can contemplate that. The next question was on the topic of today, and I said, would North Korea take the deal that if the United States, and say China and South Korea and Japan, the regional allies, if we absolutely guaranteed the Kim Jong Un regime's security, would he give up his intercontinental ballistic missile, his nuclear capability, and his testing capability? Would he take that deal? Security for the nukes and the ICBMs. Again, question goes back, translator, and very simple answer. And he looked at me and said, there is no security without the nukes and the ICBMs. So we have a difficult challenge, if that's the way they think, which I think many of us do think that that is the way they think. And so, as you know, what's happening in North Korea is that they are testing. They are testing. And the threat is increasing. In fact, for over a year, the experts have been saying it's not a matter of if, but when North Korea is going to develop an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile that could hit not just places like my state of Alaska and Hawaii, but the entire continental United States. And I think if you saw the Washington Post story yesterday, that indicated that the when day is almost upon us. So let me lead you the lead paragraph of that story that appeared in the Post yesterday. North Korea will be able to field a reliable nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile as early as next year. U.S. officials have concluded in a confidential assessment that dramatically shrinks the timeline for when Pyongyang could strike American cities with atomic weapons, unquote. That was in the paper yesterday. This new assessment, leaked by somebody relating to the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, shaves a full 2 years off the time we thought that the North Koreans would be able to develop a nuclear-tipped ICBM. So this is something to worry about, something we should all worry about. And my goal and the goal of our military leaders, and I believe the Department of Defense, is that we need to be ready when that time comes. Now, in the debate, you hear some people who still have concerns and doubts about missile defense. And what they have been saying is, well, look, this is going to happen eventually, but what we can do with North Korea is what we've done with Russia and China, essentially the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Kim Jong Un wouldn't do anything with this capability because he knows that that would be the end of his regime. Well, mutually assured destruction, if you remember, always assumes a rational actor. Always assumes a rational actor. And if you look at the activities of Kim Jong Un, including the recent assassination in an airport of his half-brother, and many, many other activities and actions and decisions undertaken by this dictator, I don't think you can assume a rational actor. And that's another reason why the imperative of missile defense is so important. So what I would like to talk about today is, again, a little bit more on the increasing threat, America's current missile defense architecture, and what we in the Senate and on the House side have been doing in the National Defense Authorization Act just within the last couple of weeks to have a more robust and integrated missile defense system. So, with regard to the threat, we are no longer fooled. Kim Jong Un is clearly focused on getting a nuclear-tipped ICBM and has indicated that he will use it against the United States. I think if you look at the next slide, do we have slides up here? When you look at what they have been doing in terms of testing, just on the nuclear side, since Kim Jong Un has come into power, there's been 5 nuclear tests. And it's with regard to the ICBMs that his testing is really accelerated. As a matter of fact, he has done more nuclear tests and ICBM tests than his father and grandfather combined. Well, what does this mean? You know, some people make light of the fact that a lot of their tests fail. But those of you who know about our missile defense system and our space system over the course of decades, failure is often when you are learning. And the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, General Hyten, in testimony before the Armed Services Committee, had this to say about the testing and the failure. North Korea is going fast. Test, fail, succeed. And they're learning. And you can see them learning because that's the way you do it in the rocket business. Test, fail, succeed. He also said the threat from North Korea continues to increase at an unprecedented pace. It's not just the testing, it's the development of capabilities such as solid propelled missile systems, solid fuel, that could be fired with limited time and limited notice. So this is continuing, and it's an important issue that all of us need to focus on. So what do we need to do? Well, I think we need to significantly bolster our missile defense. And we also need to make sure that we can send a message that if this leader of this country is unstable, and if he did try to launch 1 or 2 or 3 ICBMs at the United States, we can have the capability to say we will shoot those down with a much more robust missile defense system, and then we will massively retaliate. And even if you're unstable, like he is, you might not like those odds. And that's why missile defense is so important. So let me talk about the architecture of our missile defense system, and in particular, the key role that my state of Alaska plays. I often talk about Alaska constituting 3 pillars of America's military might. First, we are the hub of air combat power for the Asia Pacific and the Arctic. If you look at all the Air Force, and Army assets in Alaska in terms of air power, it's a very, very impressive amount of military hardware. In particular, with F-35s now coming to Alaska, we will be the only place in the world that has over 100 combat-coded 5th-generation fighters, F-35s and F-22s, in one state. That's a lot of firepower in a key strategic location. We are also a strategic platform for which expeditionary forces can be launched at a moment's notice. Again, because of our strategic location, anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, the 2 Army brigades, active duty Army brigades that are in Alaska, can get pretty much anywhere, including the Korean Peninsula, within 7 to 8 hours. As a matter of fact, the 425, the only airborne brigade combat team in the Asia Pacific, is the strategic reserve for any contingency on the Korean Peninsula. And third, and most importantly for today's discussion, we are the cornerstone of our nation's missile defense system. Now, all of you know that our missile defense system is actually a layered system with regional defenses like THAAD and Aegis systems, but then also a ground-based system that protects the homeland. Well, that ground-based system is primarily based in Alaska. In fact, Alaska has 3 key sites that protect the U.S. in terms of our homeland missile defense. First and foremost is Fort Greely. That's home to 40 ground-based interceptors, and that will be in place by the end of this year. And the home of the 49th Missile Defense Battalion. That is an Army Alaska Guard unit that I love to brag about. Their unofficial motto is something that I love to repeat. The 300, protecting the 300 million. 300 men and women in the Alaska Army National Guard and that Missile Defense Battalion protecting the entire country. They are literally modern-day Spartans. Second is Clear Air Force Station, which is the oldest missile warning site in North America, but importantly, it is the future home of the upgraded early warning radar and first long-range discrimination radar site in the country, which is going to be central to America's missile defense, and it's also home to the 213th Space Warning Squadron. And finally, at Erickson Air Station, way out on the tip of the Aleutian chain on Shimia Island, is the critical, but now very old, X-band radar Cobra Dane. So these are what make up the systems in Alaska. But what are we doing to more broadly address the strategic challenges that we see with regard to missile defense? Well, I think finally we're starting to do a lot. First, at the Pentagon, we are conducting a missile defense review. And the point of that is to identify ways to strengthen missile defense capabilities and rebalance homeland and theater defense priorities and highlight priority funding areas. That report, that review, is due out at the end of this year. But, as I've argued to my colleagues in the Senate, we shouldn't be waiting on that. That's going to be important. It's going to be informative. But things are happening too quickly to say, all right, we're going to wait for the Pentagon for a report that may or may not come out at the end of the year, and to start implementing elements of that report into legislation, you would literally be waiting another year. So what we did, and a number of us in the room here were responsible for that, is about a year ago, I began working on a bill that we've called the Advancing America's Missile Defense System Act of 2017. And again, appreciate what we tried to do. We brought in the experts. This was not some kind of 1 or 2 page bill. This is a very deep dive in terms of what we and officials at the Pentagon, experts in the industry, experts here, experts at MDA thought we would need to upgrade and protect our missile defense system. Right now, I'm proud to say that 1/4 of the United States Senate, 25 U.S. senators, are now co-sponsors of this act, of this missile defense, Advancing America's Missile Defense Act of 2017. We passed out an earlier, a previous editorial from the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago that focused exclusively on my bill and said missile defense is imperative and we need to get behind the Congress of the United States. The administration needs to get behind Senator Sullivan's bill. One of the things that was emphasized in the Wall Street Journal, and this is important from a political perspective, is that it's bipartisan. As some of you know, missile defense used to be kind of viewed through a partisan lens. And some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle weren't so enthusiastic about that. I think that dynamic is changing dramatically. And it's changing because everybody sees what the threat is. So as I mentioned 3 weeks ago, we marked up the National Defense Authorization Act. That's done in a classified setting, but I can tell you we had a robust debate with regard to missile defense. And the debate essentially was between, hey, we know, everybody knows we have a challenge, but what should we do about it? Some said we should wait for the Pentagon to let them tell us what to do with this review that's due out at the end of the year. I strongly, strongly disagreed with that position and said we need to lead and we need to act now because the North Koreans aren't waiting and they need to see action on the U.S. side. So I think that argument won the day because if you look at the NDAA that came out from the committee and it's now public, about 80 to 85% of my bill is now in the base bill of the NDAA. So what is that? Let me give you a few of the highlights. It calls for increasing our ground-based missile interceptors by 28. That would be 14 more and 14 new silos at Fort Greely and 14 additional ready to be used for additional testing. Importantly, and this to me is probably the most critical aspect of my bill, is that it starts to fund and look at a space-based sensor of architecture capable of supporting missile defense not only in the homeland but throughout the world. What I've referred to as having a space-based sensor that gives the United States an unblinking eye in terms of our ability to integrate different systems, THAAD, Aegis, Homeland Security. We don't have that capability yet. Every single expert Every single expert who has testified in front of the Armed Services Committee or has written on this says we need that space-based system to integrate our overall systems to provide the most capability and awareness for missile defense. And in this bill, we authorize, in my view, too modest a sum, but a beginning to begin building that space-based architecture. There's a requirement for a report for an additional, from a total of 100 ground-based missile interceptors, not just looking at Alaska and California, where they currently exist, at Vandenberg and Fort Greely, but in the Midwest and the East Coast. The bill has an emphasis on accelerating the deployment of new technologies, particularly the advanced kill vehicles, additional multi-layered kill vehicles on top of the warheads. In something I think is actually quite important, has a sense of Congress, and this is something General Hyten and other experts in the military have talked about, said that we need to also have support from the Congress to change our culture. Yes, we've been advancing with regard to testing, but often there's a sense that if any of these tests are a failure, it's somehow viewed as a total failure for our program. Well, even when we fail, we learn. And I think North Korea has shown that. So there's a strong focus on testing. So those are the elements that we think are important in the NDAA. In addition to that, the entire MDA's unfunded priorities, totaling $630 million, that relate to the GMD system, the THAAD system, Aegis, are all authorized to be funded in this bill. Also, if you've seen just recently in news reports, the House bill with regard to the NDA, led by my colleague, Congressman Don Young, Alaska's Congressman Don Young, introduced a similar version, and the vast majority of that bill was included in the NDAA markup in the House. So I think when we go into conference, missile defense is going to be strongly represented on the House and Senate side, and we'll have a good opportunity to advance missile defense, which is, I believe, has now become a bipartisan issue. So let me conclude with a little bit of good news. Yes, North Korea is dramatically increasing its capability, but I believe we, as a government, are finally waking up to this threat and are starting to do something about it, and it's becoming a bipartisan issue. And that's when things move in the national defense space. As I mentioned, I'm very, very confident that the final passage of the NDAA is going to have robust missile defense elements to it. Our Pentagon is undertaking a very thorough review, and my argument was, we act in the Congress now. If the Defense Review on Missile Defense says we need more or we should do something else, we can always add to that. And our testing, importantly, is showing a lot of progress. We are calling for more testing. Alaska also plays a key role in our missile defense testing with our spaceport complex out at Kodiak Island. But if you've seen just in the last month a successful test of shooting down an ICBM from Vandenberg Air Force Base, and another testing success of a THAAD system at Kodiak Island, which the last 14 of those tests on the THAAD system have all been successful. So we are advancing. We are advancing politically, we are advancing legislatively, and we are advancing with regard to testing. But we need to keep doing more because the North Koreans aren't going to stop. And this is going to be a critical capability for the United States to have a much more robust defense, missile defense system that can ensure our safety in the face of an increasing threat. So again, I want to thank Heritage for hosting this conference today and having the opportunity to say a few words, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
congressman has agreed to answer a few questions. If you could raise your hand, state your name and affiliation if you have one, and then and please wait for a microphone so that our online audiences can hear you as well. Sir, yes, please.
Senator, thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation. Two things. Number one, the Western mind seems to be saying all options have been exhausted. Well, I don't think so. I think there is still a ray of hope for talking with this young man. I think that's advantage. Being young is advantage compared to his father and grandfather. So I think I still have a ray of hope. Number two, stop depending on China. I don't think that's nice to depend on somebody else for our intention. And I don't think China is going to do anything for us anyway to begin with. So can you comment on those?
Sure. Well, look, your point on the ray of hope. So you might recall about 2 months ago, President Trump invited all 100 U.S. senators to go over to the White House to be briefed on the administration's North Korean policy. And I think almost every senator went, and it was the entire national security team from the Trump administration, the president, the vice president, H.R. McMaster, General Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, General Dunford, the D&I director, Dan Coates. I thought it was a very, very useful briefing because what they were trying to do, they described the threat, they described the strategy, and as all of you know, America is at the kind of apex of its power from a national security and foreign policy standpoint when the executive branch and the Congress are working together and when Democrats and Republicans are working together. And that's what they were trying to do. At the end of this briefing, they literally said, this is the strategy, this is what we're focused on. You have to help us. You senators go out and meet with world leaders, you travel to different countries, you need to help reinforce this strategy. And the key element of the strategy, which continues today, is on diplomacy. So it goes to your point of hope. Now, I'm not sure I would use the term hope, but diplomacy, importantly, needs to be backed up by credible other options. And I think one of the significant reasons why in the last administration diplomacy on this and other issues like Syria and the Middle East and Russia and Ukraine were not successful is because nobody in the world by the end of the Obama administration believed that any of their diplomacy was backed by the use of force. Nobody. And that actually undermines your diplomacy. So what this administration is focused on is diplomacy right now, but it's clear that they are looking at options with regard to the diplomacy being backed up by the use of force. And I think that makes your diplomacy more effective. So I'm certainly supportive of what they're trying to do, and everybody wants the goal of this being resolved in a way that does not require military action, but we need to be prepared for it. With regard to China, I actually support what they're trying to do with regard to China in terms of the key role China could play. It doesn't appear right now that that's working. And, you know, let me just give you one example. As the president was trying to push on the Chinese option, and so are many other members of his cabinet, the Chinese were being very aggressive with regard to undermining the deployment of THAAD in South Korea. Very aggressive with regard to the South Korean companies that have been supportive of that. And to me, that just shows that I agree with the emphasis on trying to get China to play a key role here. They do have a lot of leverage, more than any other country over North Korea. But their actions right now are showing that they're not taking that seriously. So I'm supportive of where we are. But a key element of any strategy that we have, whether it's diplomatic, whether it's working with the Chinese, whether it might be in the future military force, which, by the way, my view is that's an issue that the administration has to come to Congress for to get our authorization, and I've raised this in hearing after hearing. But a key element of all all these different elements of our strategy, we have to have a strong missile defense system that gives us leverage, that gives the president and the leaders strategic space to make these difficult decisions. And that's one of the reasons I've been pressing for it so relentlessly.
In the middle, please.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Huisheng Shou. I'm from Tsinghua University in Beijing. I want to just push up this issue a little bit about the THAAD system.
Yeah.
Because in my view, and also from what I know in China, there's been strong voice to support the cooperation between China and the U.S. to solve this problem. And we do believe that, and this probably is the key to solve the entire problem. However, that it seems like right now, in China, the most difficult part for the government to persuade the public to change its policy towards North Korea is that system.
Yeah.
Because they're, for whatever the reason, the public, this perception is very negative. They believe that this is not really entirely against the North Korea, but also actually is against China's security. I mean, just objectively speaking, and this is just the perception there. And even I know that among Chinese military, there's a strong voice support to support the U.S.-China cooperation. But that kind of negative perception about the THAAD really prevents that kind of view to prevail.
Yeah.
So so my question is that how would the United States persuade the Chinese government and particularly military that this, I mean, their Chinese security will not be threatened by that? I mean, in my view, that's probably is the most important thing to deal with if we really want China to come into this game.
Well, look, it's a good question, and it's a clear area of disagreement. Now, I believe that a lot of the disagreement on THAAD has been driven by the Chinese government, where they make it such a big deal, and somehow it threatens the security of China. I just don't believe that that's the case. And I believe at the highest levels of the Chinese government, including in the military, from the sources that I talk to, there's a sense that the Chinese leadership knows that at the end of the day, this isn't about China. This isn't threatening China. What this is you have an unstable dictator, who I know China is concerned about as well, who has the capability right now to launch nuclear missiles at South Korea, at our key ally in the region, Japan, and the Koreans, and our forces in the region. Remember, it's not just the citizens of South Korea and Japan, who are our key allies, that we're trying to protect. We are trying to protect our own troops who have been in the region for over 70 years, keeping the peace and keeping that part of the world stable. And even the Chinese leadership would agree that the American presence has done a lot for stability in the region. So it is completely within the rights of the United States of America to say, we have a serious threat to our allies and our troops in the region, and we're going to protect them. And my view is the Chinese need to understand that, because it has never been, and this is, whether it's President Obama saying this, or President Trump, or the former administration officials in the Obama administration, or the current administration's officials in the Trump administration, it has been a consistent message. THAAD deployment, or the Aegis system in the same region, has never been about China. It's about protecting our troops, our allies, their citizens, and our citizens in the region, and I think China should just accept that. Yeah, well, I think we have time for one more question. Yep, thanks.
Hi, Senator. James Drew from Aviation Week. There's been a lot of talk about, along with the space sensor layer, also putting interceptors and high-power lasers in space.
Yeah.
You know, much the same as the Strategic Defense Initiative of the Reagan administration. Do you think it's time to start seriously considering that sort of a deployment of these sorts of interceptors in space, or should we just focus on the sensor layer?
So, James, is a good question. My focus right now, and I think where the Congress and the Pentagon should be, is on the sensor layer for now. I mean, even the sensor layer is going to be costly. And but on the good news side, as you all know, what's happening, particularly with the commercial launch of space sensors, that the costs are actually coming down. But to me, one of the things that, as I've been pressing this bill, one of the areas of pushback that I get from Democrats and Republicans is the space-based system is too expensive. This is just the sensor system. Well, my view is, given the threat, that this is an insurance policy that most Americans would gladly accept in terms of the costs. And sometimes you need to reprioritize spending at the Pentagon given the reprioritization of threats. But to push too far too fast, particularly when the technology on some of the issues you mentioned is not ready, I think might be more than the kind of political system can bear. So what I've been focused on right now, and what my bill focuses on, and what the NDAA focuses on, is architecture that is space-based, but it's focused on sensors, not anything beyond that. What MDA is doing, I mean, they're, again, what I always like to do is look at where the technology is. So I talked about those kill vehicles as accelerating that technology. As you probably know, that's actually very close, that technology, right? And so is the space-based sensor system. So my focus has been helping accelerate new technology, but don't focus on the deployment of it until it's ready. So again, that's why I've been so focused on the space-based sensor aspect and not pushing too hard on other elements of developing in space, simply because of the costs and the fact that the technology, in my view, is not that advanced. Well, thank you very much, and very much appreciate the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you.
Well, that was a wonderful introduction to the issues at hand, and we will follow up with our expert panel. I will shorten introductions in the interest of time. We have Brigadier General Kenneth Todoroff, who was a Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Agency. He oversaw fielding of the U.S. missile defense system, and currently he's a Director of Global Air and Missile Defense at Northrop Grumman Corporation. We have our very own Bruce Klinger, Senior Research Fellow at Heritage, Mr. North Korea, Mr. Sanctions, Mr. Let's Get That to South Korea. Thank you so much for joining us, Bruce. Bruce has had decades of service in the U.S. government and then continues to serve at the Heritage Foundation. And Dr. Austin Long, senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, also worked nuclear deterrence and strategy issues at the Joint Staff in the past. Thank you so much for joining us. Bruce?
Oh, yeah, I'll go first. I'm not a missile defense person, but I do like to think I know a thing or two about North Korea. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about sort of reviewing the threat and then a bit of, where do we go from there. So North Korea is always timely, especially recently, because North Korea always seems to be doing a nuclear test or a missile test. And now there are recent reports that we may have another ICBM test this week. So that's another weekend ruined or holiday ruined or whatever. And just yesterday I testified before the Asia Subcommittee of Senate Foreign Relations, where the focus was on North Korea and sort of what to do about the threat. So as you know, we had a ICBM threat on the 4th of July, and as has been the pattern recently, North Korea fired it to an unusually high trajectory so as not to fly over Japan, as well as to perhaps test a RV reentry vehicle. Had it been fired for effect to a normal trajectory, it could have gone 7,000, perhaps 9,000 kilometers. Certainly puts all of Alaska in range. Now, what we've seen is in the media kind of this tendency of both oh my God, let's put on our helmets and get under the bed, this is a very real threat, but then at the same time sort of downplaying it. Sort of, well, it can only hit Alaska. Well, I'd ask Senator Sullivan about, the only, nomenclature there. But also, there's this tendency to be, downplay it. So, it's sort of like with this ICBM, like it can only hit Alaska. Well, that's like saying if a little old lady drives a Maserati only to 60 miles an hour, then that's what that vehicle is capable of. Well, we know it's more capable than that. And we've seen in static engine rocket tests last year that given the engines and the propellant, that surprised a lot of experts and that they were better than predicted. That experts have said that the mobile ICBM, when deployed, could probably hit New York and Washington. So I think there's a sense of continual surprise about North Korean missiles. And as the senator said, they always fail until they don't. Well, if you look at the deployment or the testing patterns, the ones that are having failures until they don't are the ones still in development. The ones that are already deployed, they're having a very high success rate, and those, they tell us afterwards, are being exercised for the war plan. So when they test missile like a Nodong last year, which we know is nuclear capable, they said, oh, we were practicing a nuclear air burst over the port of Busan, which is a key node where the U.S. would be flowing reinforcements through. And then this year when they fired 4 extended-range Scuds towards Japan, they said, oh, we were practicing nuclear air attacks on U.S. bases in Japan. So we know what these missiles are for. And again, on the surprise, I worked on an unclassified national intelligence estimate when I was at CIA in 1999, and we said we thought North Korea would have the capability of sending a nuclear warhead to the United States by 2015. So we may have been off a few years, but it's not a surprise. We've been seeing this threat coming for decades. In addition to the ICBM, we have North Korea working on 2 different IRBMs that can put Guam, a key node of the U.S. defense of the Pacific, under threat. So they had the Musudan, a successful test after a number of failures. They had a successful test last year. Again, had that been fired to a normal trajectory, it could have hit Guam. And then this year we had a new IRBM, the Hwasong-12, which again had a successful test and successfully tested a reentry vehicle. We also have the submarine-launched ballistic missile, had a successful test last year. And the concern about the SLBM is not only is it a mobile launcher, obviously because of submarine, harder to track, but it exposes South Korea's flanks to a SLBM nuclear attack. Right now, the Patriot and the THAAD, their sensors are all directed to the north. That's sort of the Manner, the X-band radar, et cetera. And right now, the South Korean Navy doesn't have a defense against an SLBM. Their SM-2 missiles are only anti-ship missile capable. They aren't anti-ballistic missile capable. So they need something like a SM-6, which would probably be better than an SM-3 for them, but that has not yet been deployed. And then finally, the MRBMs, as I said, the Nodong is already nuclear capable. That puts South Korea and Japan under a nuclear threat today, not several years away, and not some theoretical threat. Now, what to do about it? To oversimplify, there may be three main lanes in the road. One is do a preemptive military attack on North Korea to prevent them from completing the development of the ICBM. I disagree. I wrote a paper, Save Preemption for Imminent North Korean Attack. I think if, intercepting a missile in midair or taking it out on a launch stand or a mobile missile launcher when it's not a clear and present danger to the United States, it's not going to hit our sovereign soil. It's not going to hit the soil of our allies. I think you don't try to intercept it. It's, I think, needlessly provocative and risks instituting or initiating an all-out war with a nuclear power. The other one, engagement. Been there, done that, got the T-shirt, it didn't work. North Korea has had 8 international agreements, either promising never to give up nuclear or never to build nuclear weapons, or to give up the weapons they promised never to build. They all failed. South Korea has had 240 inter-Korean agreements with North Korea trying to moderate their behavior, induce political and economic reform. They all failed. We've had 2-party, 3-party, 4-party, 6-party talks. They all failed. And Moon Jae-in, the newly elected South Korean president, has been trying to reach out to North Korea, and he's already been rebuffed several times. North Korea didn't change its behavior. It's continued to launch missiles, even as Moon, like Barack Obama in 2009, has been trying to extend an open-handed dialogue. They've pushed it back, and they've said his efforts are nonsense. So when I was in Europe last month, I met with North Korean officials, wrote an op-ed about it in the Washington Post. They very clearly said, mimicking what they've been saying publicly for years, denuclearization is totally off the table. There's nothing you or Seoul can offer to induce us to abandon our nuclear weapons. We're ready to talk about a peace treaty or fight. So right now they have no inclination to engage with the U.S. or South Korea. So finally, and I know I'm getting near the end of my time, we need to increase the pressure on North Korea in conjunction with the other instruments of national power. So when President Obama said North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth, he was flat out wrong. We have done things to other nations we have not yet done to North Korea. So we've talked a good game, but we have not delivered. Last year was the first year that the U.S. had cumulatively sanctioned as many North Korean entities as we had sanctioned those of Zimbabwe. So we need to more fully enforce U.S. law. And right now, the Trump administration has not yet distinguished its policy from that of Obama's. He has not he's not stopped pulling U.S. punches. So I'm hoping that we will see more secondary sanctions against Chinese entities, like the singular action against the Bank of Dandong a couple weeks ago. There are talks about it, and Assistant Secretary Thornton mentioned that yesterday in her testimony. So I'm hoping we see additional actions to enforce U.S. law against all entities that are violating U.S. law, including those that happen to be Chinese. So we're hoping, and I can get into more detail during Q&A about the pressure tactics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. General Tadaro.
Michaela, I want to say, first of all, thank you for having me on the panel today, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation as well. I'm honored to be here and an opportunity to talk about a subject that I've been thinking about and have been in practice with for a number of years, and that's ballistic missile defense, particularly vis-a-vis the North Korea question. So my role, I think, on the panel today is to provide you, from my former operational hat as a military officer, sort of the operational view of the effectiveness of our existing ballistic missile defense system, and perhaps from a programmatic standpoint, what are some of the things we potentially do about it? So I thought, driving over here today, I thought maybe the best way to do that was via a story, which I think, if you'll allow me just for a moment, will perhaps be instructive about where the current BMDS is and where potentially we go in the future. So it was a few years ago, before I was the Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Agency. I had a job in our headquarters in Colorado Springs at NORAD and United States Northern Command. I was the Deputy Director of Operations there, and part of my portfolio was to oversee sort of the day-to-day operations of our ballistic missile defense system. And it was back in the day, Bruce, when we had sort of a lot of predictive intel and warning when there would be a Taepodong 2 on a launch pad somewhere. We had sometimes months of sort of I&W indications and warning that event was going to take place. That was a luxury back then. We could sort of set our forces and array our ballistic missile defense system to be ready for it. And I happened to be with my 4-star boss, who was the commander of NORAD and the United States Northern Command, and joined at his hip because we knew the launch was imminent. We were in Washington, D.C., and we were sort of holed up in the National Military Command Center right across the river in the Pentagon, waiting for indications and warning that the launch was going to happen, and then sort of at the ready position, heaven forbid, should that threat be coming our way, to be able to do something about it. And so it was a December night, I think, and a cold night in the Pentagon, as often is the case in December. And I remember my boss saying something to me that sort of struck home. And I kind of looked at him and said, "Hey, boss, how you feeling? You know, we're waiting for the actual launch of the TD2. We didn't think that it was going to be a threat to the U.S. Homeland, but his job, he's one of a handful of people that can issue what's called Weapons Release Authority, WRA, and that is essentially to allow the ballistic missile defense system to operate as it's designed to do, and again, heaven forbid, shoot down a threat to our homeland." So I asked him how he was feeling, and he actually said, "Ken, I'm feeling pretty good. I have confidence in the system." And I got a sense from him that there was a calm about him, that despite the fact that this was probably not going to be a threat to the homeland, if it became one, and if we deemed it a threat to the homeland, that he had full faith and confidence in the system that was going to do its job and to be able to deal with that threat. So that's the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed, there was some frustration that night. And all this has a purpose, by the way, when I get to where I think we take the ballistic missile defense system to stay ahead of the threat. So I remember that we were waiting for intelligence passes of overhead imagery, of satellite imagery to fly over the launch site so our analysts could take a look at it and really give us a sort of a countdown clock as to when we thought the launch was going to happen. And my boss got a little frustrated because it had been a couple hours or so since we had the last pass, and there was maybe cloud cover in the region. And I remember him sort of saying, "Hey, Ken, when is the next pass? When are we going to get more information? I'm kind of getting antsy, waiting for this launch to happen, waiting for our analysts to give us the latest information." And what struck me about that was we didn't have, as Senator Sullivan talked about, an unblinking eye on the potential threat. And so that's something that I'll talk more about in a moment. What do we do about that? Finally, there was a number of outages that night. If you know anything about the ballistic missile defense system, it's really a system of systems. And a lot of people talk and think about the interceptors and the kill vehicles, but it is really a whole array of sensors and radars, both terrestrial-based, some sea-based systems that work together to paint a picture for the operational warfighter so that he, or today it's she, the commander of NORAD Northcom, can have a good enough sort of situational awareness and take action if necessary. And so I remember that night that one of the radars, one of the TIPI-2 radars, went down for maintenance, a scheduled maintenance, but if you don't bring it down and reset it periodically, it's not as effective. I remember also that our sea-based X-band radar, which is it's a tremendous platform that's in the Pacific, was being affected by some heavy sea states. And so the crew actually had to move it out of the optimal position to get to a sort of an alternate permission. It was still effective, it still did its job, but it didn't quite have the look that we perhaps needed to make our system as effective as possible. Similarly, with our Navy ships that were in the region, they had to be moved out for sea state conditions. It was a stormy night in the seas in the area. So that struck me as well as sort of the current state of the ballistic missile defense system when you take into account all that happened that night, that yes, we had full faith and confidence that it was going to work, but no, we didn't have an unblinking eye over the potential threat. And our system, that's a very, very good and robust system, had some challenges to it based on environmental factors that we couldn't control. So at the end of the day, the Taepodong 2 launch happened. As we predicted, it went to the south. It was an attempt to launch a rudimentary satellite into space. It was never deemed a threat to the homeland. Our system worked as advertised and beautifully. If it had come our way, we would have been able to take action to it. But I learned a lot that night, and it's made me think a lot since about the state of play of our BMDS, or our ballistic missile defense system. As Senator Sullivan rightly said, and as Bruce also pointed out, they are making tremendous strides in sort of their technological capabilities, and we're seeing some things that are clearly alarming, and Bruce laid that out very, very nicely. So how do we stay ahead? How do we take that system that today, I don't speak for the warfighter any longer, let's make that clear, but I know that the warfighter has confidence in the system to do its job, but as the threat increases in quantity and quality and diversity, how do we stay ahead? So a number of takeaways I would offer to you. First, we need to increase the capacity, the reliability, and the efficiency of the existing ballistic missile defense system. Senator talked about a lot of his ideas for that, and I certainly applaud him and the rest of our leaders who are working toward those things. The existing program of record that adds more interceptors, that adds a long-range discriminating radar, that adds additional testing is certainly on the right track, in my opinion, and we are headed down the right direction there. But we must also continue emphasis on enhancements to the BMDS, increased testing, increased diversity of the kinds of tests that we're doing. So we recently tested an ICBM target. In the future, I know the Missile Defense Agency has plans to test a salvo launch where there could be more than one target that'll challenge our system and make sure that we learn from that. Also, the idea of a two-stage ground-based interceptor, which is right now there are 3 stages. Two-stage interceptor would give us more battle space, if you will, and actually increase the warfighter's effectiveness in that mission space as well. And we also have to make that existing BMDS better than it is today. So programs like the redesigned kill vehicle and the multi-object kill vehicle, but also new technology that frankly is not, we need to find cost-effective ways to improve the BMDS. For instance, discrimination algorithms. How do you discriminate in space, that very complex scene, pick out the lethal object and make sure that you're hitting what you want to hit? We don't have to necessarily buy a whole lot of new systems to do that. There are a lot of, through the digital transformation, a lot of things we can do to make our existing BMDS better. So that's number one. Number two, I would offer that we need to think about the solution in a different way. I'm fond of saying that more is not necessarily more when it's more of the same. And so as that threat increases, as Bruce talks about, what are the different ways we can get at that problem? I'm not suggesting that we get away from hit-to-kill or what we have today. Hit-to-kill will always be a part of the warfighter's toolkit, to be sure, but there are different ways we can think about the problem of missile defense. And the Senator mentioned one, and I absolutely agree. A space-based tracking and discrimination capability for the nation is paramount. Recall my story when we had gaps in coverage, when we had times when we couldn't have that unblinking eye over what was happening on the peninsula. We need to make sure that we improve our intelligence assets, that we improve our ballistic missile defense tracking and discrimination capability in space. It doesn't have to be a capability germane or unique just to missile defense. It can have a multi-purpose role. You can do it on hosted payloads. This notion that missile defense in space tracking and discrimination is too expensive is frankly folly in my mind. There's a lot of good ideas out there. We need to figure out an effective and efficient way to do it, but make no question we need to do it. We also need to think about new technologies, directed energy, cyber, high-powered microwave, non-kinetic ways to get at the problem. Again, hit-to-kill will always be part of that equation. We need to keep it as part of the equation and keep enhancing our capabilities there. But what are the other things we can do in those new technology ideas to once again get at this problem? We need to think about the problem in a new way, as the problem, as Bruce described, is anew. And third, I would also offer to you this, that some people think about missile defense as a catcher's mitt or some kind of a shield or a bubble. It's never been designed to be just that. It's a matter of an offense-defense mix. So from a former warfighter's perspective, I would say that you have to consider capability in missile defense to stop certain amount of incoming threats, yes, but just to give the warfighter and the nation options and time, as Senator Sullivan said, to strike back in a very effective and powerful way. It's part of the deterrence equation, to be sure, but if we think of missile defense simply as a shield and a catcher's mitt and try to buy our way out of this problem as this threat increases, it's a strategy that will not be sustaining from a cost perspective. So don't think about missile defense in a vacuum. You have to think about it within the other capabilities that the nation has. And so, Michaela, once again, thank you. I just wanted to offer those brief thoughts and some ideas about the future of missile defense, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And speaking of other things we can do, Austin.
Great, thanks very much. So let me first say that my remarks today represent my own views, not the views of the RAND Corporation or any of our sponsors. But I want to pick up almost exactly where the General left off in terms of offensive capabilities, and particularly some that have been in the news over the past year, so-called left-of-launch capabilities. It's very hard to talk about left of launch in an unclassified setting. There have been a few news articles. So I'm going to talk more conceptually than I am about specific programs, but I'll give you some examples of actual fielded technology in other contexts that give you an idea of what can be done. So first, I'll talk about what left of launch is. It is, as the name suggests, an effort to defeat missiles before they leave the ground, so prior to launch. That means in a silo, on a mobile target, wherever they are. It's potentially preemptive. This gets to the sort of remark that Bruce made about preemption versus prevention. We're not talking preemptive in the sense necessarily of defeating a North Korean program today, but in the event of a severe crisis or indication and warning that the North Koreans might actually launch, preempting at that point, because obviously to get left of launch, you're going to have some level of preemption. It can include kinetic effects, but I will focus mostly today on non-kinetic effects. The general already mentioned cyber. Another is electronic warfare, which could include the high-powered microwave systems he mentioned. It also includes novel forms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, potentially, that allow you to have high fidelity on where mobile targets are in real time, that don't rely quite as much on the kind of overhead imagery passes that the general is talking to. And so here I'll give one example. Till relatively recently, I lived in New York. A few years ago, there was a rash of smash and grab robberies at pharmacies where people would just run in, grab a bunch of pills off the shelf, and run out. And it was very tough for the New York Police Department to deal with this challenge because, you know, pills are small, easy to move, hard to sort of blanket every single pharmacy with police to prevent, in the sort of sense the general was talking about, a catcher's mitt approach. So instead, what they did is they acquired commercial off-the-shelf so-called tagging, tracking, and locating. So these are little tiny chips, smaller than a pill, and they put them in random pill bottles throughout the city and waited for someone to grab them and take them. Once they did, they were able, in a fairly dense urban environment, to track them back not just to the building they were in, but to the room they're in. So if you're talking about that kind of capability that the New York Police Department can acquire, you can sort of imagine at least the frontier of possibilities that very significant investment would make. So there are a lot of potential capabilities, at least, that are theoretically available. North Korea is a hard target, of course. So I'll shift gears now from sort of talking a little bit about the technology, and we can talk more in Q&A about that, to talking about the origin of the concept of left of launch and why I think the term itself can be misleading, and I want people to be very clear about what we're talking about because there are risks associated with it. So, you know, I trace the origin of the term left of launch to a little over a decade ago, the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had something called left of boom. Left of boom was an effort to prevent the detonation of improvised explosive devices, right? So we had an entire set of programs that were intended to disrupt the production pipeline for IEDs. So this was a whole intelligence and operations effort to get ahead of that curve for the exact same reason that the catcher's mitt approach can't work on its own. In missile defense, it couldn't work on its own in the IED fight either. You can only put so much armor on vehicles, you can only do so much with jammers, et cetera. So it was the same kind of analogous effort. There was also an even earlier effort. The U.S. Navy had something called outer air battle, which was to prevent carrier strike groups from being saturated by Soviet anti-ship cruise missiles. Rather than try to shoot down what they called the arrows, the cruise missiles in flight, they would push out a range at which the Navy could engage Soviet naval bombers to try and shoot down those bombers before they could launch. So the term was called shooting the archer, not the arrows. So I think these are useful analogies, but they can be misleading. And the problem is, in both of those environments you're talking about, you're already in a warfighting setting, right? So with IEDs, we weren't really trying to deter insurgents. We were just trying to defeat them. And in the Navy example I gave, this was in the context of a war that had already begun with the Soviet Union. Some of the things you would have to do to make left of launch work would have to take place in peacetime, and they would have to take place on the territory of the DPRK. If you're going to put the kind of sensors I just talked about in place, if you're going to put the kind of access in place that you need for cyber operations, as the general spoke to, these are things that will have to take place in peacetime and potentially on North Korean territory. So the possibility of escalation resulting from the discovery of these activities is non-trivial. It's not astronomical, but it's not zero. So I'll spend the last couple of minutes of my time talking about what I see as the pros and cons of pursuing aggressive left of launch capabilities with the DPRK. The first is exactly what the general talked to. These capabilities potentially make the intercept part of missile defense much easier. You have fewer weapons being launched in salvos if you've taken out many on the ground. The other piece is you can interfere with adversary command and control to prevent the launch of salvos even with surviving weapons. Rather than having to deal with missiles in the dozens at a time, even if the adversary has surviving weapons, you might be able to deal with them one at a time, which makes the problem easier. So it's a huge potential advantage for defeating the North Korean missile threat. Second, I would argue you have to think holistically about the entire process by which the North Koreans might get a nuclear weapon onto U.S. or allied territory. There are many, many points of potential opportunity in there to cause interference. So that starts with arming and fusing of nuclear warheads. It's an incredibly complex process. Even minor failure in a lot of arming and fusing could cause the weapon to fail or fizzle. You have the weapon itself, whatever the missile system is. These are complicated systems that have rocket motors that have to fire appropriately. You have the platform the missile comes from, so that could be a mobile system. If you can turn off the transporter erector launcher that actually puts the missile in place to launch, that actually neutralizes the weapon, at least for a long period of time. Even weapons in silos, if there's a silo that has a cap on it, that has to function. If the silo cap can't open because you've interfered with it in some way, the missile is non-functional. And then finally, as I alluded to, you have enemy command and control, the whole set of processes by which they would give orders to their forces. If you can interfere with that, you can at least temporarily freeze those missiles. So there's lots of opportunities if you have a sort of full spectrum approach to left of launch. The downside, there are several. So the first is a lot of the capabilities I just talked to depend on remaining secret in order to be effective. You can't really tell the North Koreans, by the way, we've managed to put tracking devices on all of your mobile missiles, you should be deterred now. Right? If you reveal that and they believe you, then they can take countermeasures. The same is true of cyber. The same is true of most of these capabilities. And if they discover them themselves, then again, there's the potential for escalation as they become concerned. There's also the issue with test. We can test missile defense interceptors, and we should. It's difficult to test under realistic conditions these capabilities, except in the moment of crisis. So the confidence level is never going to be quite as robust as one would hope. Second, I already mentioned this, it may require aggressive peacetime action. If you talk about trying to use intelligence sources and methods to introduce faulty components into the North Korean supply chain, if you try and introduce sensors, et cetera, there are these risks. And then third, and related to that, it's the stability issue. If the North Koreans believe, as the senator said, that there is no security without these weapons, and they see the United States and its allies mounting a full spectrum campaign to neutralize this, there's certainly the possibility that they will react as though war were imminent, and thus we would have a crisis that we would otherwise seek to forestall. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Please, again, wait for the microphone and introduce yourself if you have questions. Sir, over here.
Thank you. John Burton with the Korea Times. David, and this is addressing left of launch. David Sanger in the New York Times has suggested that methods have already been carried out against some of the North Korean missile tests, and that's the reason for the high failure rate, at least with some of the missile types. But there's been a dispute about that, whether that's been going on or not. Can you comment on that?
I can't comment with any accuracy about what the claims in the Times, but I will say it highlights one of the tricky things that gets back to testing these capabilities. So let's hypothesize that those capabilities were in place. You have a choice about disrupting tests, but the learning part about tests is not just about failures of industrial processes that the North Koreans might have. They might learn how you're doing this, right? And if they learn how you're doing it, they might neutralize that capability. So there's a real strategic question about when to utilize these capabilities. If you use them in peacetime, the North Koreans might have a failure rate, but then they might learn. But you would have some confidence, if they haven't learned, that this system would work in wartime. On the other hand, if you wait until wartime, or crisis time, as I said, you will have less confidence. So there's a lot of, I think, really tricky strategic calculations about when and how to use these capabilities if you develop them. So that's about all I can sort of say is more hypothetical.
another question.
Stun them into silence.
All right, ma'am.
I think we solved North Korea.
Yeah, good. Okay.
It's been a good day.
Thank you. I'm Nicole with the Washington Times. I'm curious about what's going on for civilians in Alaska right now. If you know, besides the missile defense system that the military is building up, are civilians living in fear? Are they being encouraged to consider evacuation plans, or will that come up in the future? Excuse me, at all in the next year if their threat is more imminent? I don't know if any of you can speak on that.
I might just say I'm not sure whether they're hunkering down more in Alaska or not, but there have been articles just this week where in Hawaii they seem to be more nervous, where they're now initiating sort of emergency preparedness drills, and they'll be doing exercises which remind me of my childhood when we practiced, duck and cower or whatever they called it, hiding under our desks, in case of a Soviet nuclear attack. So, you had second graders or something sort of cowering in fear of nuclear attack. So, I mean, it sounds like that's what they're going to be doing in Hawaii. I don't know whether Alaska, but, it's not just something that will affect Alaska and Hawaii. Again, people are sort of, well, it can only hit those two states, which last time I checked, they're still part of the U.S. But the capability is probably much greater. It's probably already reaching CONUS. And with their Taepodong or their Unha system, that already can reach the United States. And we've had 4 U.S. 4-star generals saying, or commanders saying, I either assume that North Korea already has the ability to hit the continental U.S. with a nuclear weapon, or I have to assume for planning purposes, and that includes the commander in Korea and others. So, we may not know where they are on a development path, but we sure as heck know what path they're on. So if it's an A to Z, we don't know if they're at Z or Y or X, but we know that's their objective. So it's not something that, is limited only to those 2 states.
James.
Yeah, hi, James Drew from Aviation Week. I'm wondering if each of the panel members could maybe pick out one sort of initiative that you think would enhance the robustness of the US missile defense system as it relates to North Korea. Whether that would be, discriminating radars in Hawaii, interceptors on the East Coast. What do you think are the key pieces that need to be plugged in order to enhance the system in a meaningful way?
I would say number 1, space-based discrimination and tracking, clearly, for me.
There was another question, sir.
Charles Bush, I'm an intern with Heritage. Do you think part of the problem is that our defense system is very much modeled kind of after the Cold War model, where we have sovereign states with nuclear weapons, but they at least rely on that sort of rationale, whereas North Korea isn't very much a rational actor, and that part of our delay is that we aren't, at least our capabilities aren't sort of modeled around these sort of oddball dictatorships. Thank you.
Yeah, I disagree with sort of the oft-repeated media thing of Kim Jong Un is crazy, like his father was crazy. It's a phrase that you always see in the media, and it's not accurate. It's yes, he looks like he's, a villain out of an Austin Powers movie. He's the funny little guy with the funny little, rhomboid-shaped haircut. And, it's easy to caricature North Korea. But, he's rational. I mean, yes, he's a brutal, terrible dictator. But he's not going to wake up frothy mouth some morning in his bathrobe and press the button. So, but by thinking that, it's dangerous in 2 ways. One is it will lead people to downplay the threat of, oh, it's just this funny little guy. And, we've all seen the cartoons of, Kim Jong Un as a baby playing with nuclear weapons in his crib or something. So people sort of downplay it as a real threat. And now people are being surprised that these things are working and all that. The other danger is that people will see it as, you know, he is crazy, he may just attack us. And I think a lot of the new advocacy for a preventative attack on North Korea is based on, and I'll talk, you know, I'll ask people and say, okay, why do we need to do it? We don't like a nuclear Russia, we don't like a nuclear China, but we're living with them. What's different about North Korea? Well, he's crazy, so, you know, he may just launch a missile. I said, okay, you know, I disagree, and when I was at CIA, we did a lengthy study of Kim Jong Un or Kim Jong-il, you know, psychologists, psychiatrists, and everything, and he wasn't crazy. And I said, okay, but if we were to do a preventative attack on North Korea, how would they respond? They would know they could not respond because of the, you know, the power of our military. Like, so a rational response. So there's sort of this, we need to attack him because he's irrational, but it'd be okay to do a preemptive attack or preventative attack because he would respond rationally. So I think there's a disconnect and too much of a flippancy for people wanting to do an attack. And one of the things that I think is a benefit about missile defense is, in a way, it lengthens the fuse of war. Whether it's the THAAD in South Korea or the other systems, if you have, particularly now as North Korea brags about, demonstrates, and threatens to use nuclear weapons, the Allies may feel we have to lean further forward in doing a preemptive attack. We may feel during a crisis, you have that poor intelligence analyst bursting into the Oval Office saying, we've got pretty good intel, we see a number of missiles out in the field, they're erect, we think they're fueled, we think that they've got nuclear warheads instead of, you know, nothing or high explosives. And our assessment is we think the leadership is about to attack, it's not a political signal, and it's not just a routine exercise. Over to you, Mr. President, do you push the button or not? If you don't have good missile defense, you may say, look, I can't risk a nuclear attack on my nation or on my ally. I have to do a preemptive attack. If you are more confident in your systems, like THAAD, which gives you a much better protective envelope or bubble over South Korea or all the systems that the other panelists have described, then you may say, well, you say there's only a few missiles out there. That doesn't sound like a massive attack. I'm confident in my missile defense system, so I can wait a bit. I can let the system develop or the situation develop, and maybe it turns out, oh, sorry, sir, we got it wrong. It wasn't preparations for an attack.
We need to take last question. I'm sorry, gentleman over here.
Hi, I'm Gino Hong from the Atlantic Council. So I've read it that for nuclear counterforce, it's become a lot harder to even hide or harden the nuclear arsenal because of the, you know, precision munitions, remote sensors, or even the left-of launch tactics. So would that change the dynamics in terms of missile defense or even blocking the imminent nuclear attacks?
Are you talking about hardening the U.S. arsenal or North Korean arsenal?
In general.
Just to be clear, you're talking about the ease with which counterforce operations against North Korean targets could be executed. That's what you're asking about. Okay. So I'll just say that there are, you know, as I alluded to, a lot of new technologies and potential capabilities that could be employed. It is, as with many things, a double-edged sword. Yes, if you can destroy weapons on the ground, it makes the missile defense challenge much easier. If you can disrupt command and control, whether kinetically or non-kinetically, it makes the challenge easier. The problem is, it's the reverse of what Bruce just talked about in lengthening a crisis, right? If the adversary believes, if they go second, right, they allow you to launch a preemptive strike, then your missile defense is very effective in stopping whatever remains. They have real incentives to think about going early. They may not do so, but the point is the pressure on them goes up. So yes, it makes missile defense easier if it works, but it can make crisis more acute. Now, hopefully, people will realize this and avoid crisis. But in those situations where even though both sides are trying to avoid crisis, you end up there, the dynamics could escalate more quickly as a result.
Thank you so much, and please join me in thanking our panelists.